There are moments in history when a single decision made in shadow, driven by ambition or fear, ripples across time, altering the fate of nations. This is the story of one such moment, a betrayal so shocking it plunged medieval Europe into a century of war. Picture a knight sworn to protect his king, standing at a crossroads where loyalty and ambition collide. The air is thick with tension, the weight of his choice pressing down like a storm about to break. In that instant, he turns his back on his oath, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape kingdoms and leave countless lives shattered in its wake. Why does this one act of treachery matter so deeply? Because it wasn't just a personal failure, it was a spark that ignited a firestorm of conflict, toppling alliances and rewriting the map of power. The knight's betrayal didn't just end with his own disgrace. It unraveled the fragile peace holding the realm together, exposing the brutal truth about how quickly trust can crumble when ambition takes hold. And the most haunting question of all, how many wars, how much suffering could have been avoided if just one man had chosen differently? This video is a journey into that fateful moment and the century of chaos that followed. We'll uncover the hidden motives behind the betrayal, the political powder keg it set off, and the lessons it holds about power, loyalty, and the cost of treachery. Along the way, you'll meet the key players, kings, rebels, and unlikely heroes whose lives were forever changed by that single act. This isn't just a tale from the past. It's a mirror held up to human nature, reminding us how easily the threads of peace can fray when trust is broken. So join me as we step back into a world of intrigue, where one knight's choice became a shadow stretching across 100 years of war. Long before his name became synonymous with treachery, the knight was celebrated as the very model of chivalry, a man whose sword arm had saved his king's life more than once. Born to a minor noble family, his rise was anything but certain, yet through sheer skill and unwavering service, he carved his place in the royal court. Chronicles from the time describe him as a lion in battle, a stag in grace. His loyalty so unquestioned that the king granted him lands, titles, and a seat at the high table. Ballads sung in taverns praised his valor at the siege of Blackridge, where he held the gates alone against 20 men, buying time for the king's retreat. For years, he wore his honors with humility, his armor polished, his oaths spoken without hesitation. But the court was a place of shadows as much as light. The feudal system that rewarded his service also bred quiet rivalries, lesser nobles whispering that a man of such ambition might one day hunger for more than a king's favor. The chivalric code demanded loyalty, yet it also exalted personal glory, creating a tension that pulsed beneath the surface of every tournament and feast. Some noticed how his eyes lingered a moment too long on the crown during state ceremonies, how his laughter at the king's jest seemed practiced. Were these the signs of a man straining against his station, or merely the suspicions of envious courtiers? What makes his fall so tragic isn't just the betrayal itself, but how deeply he was trusted. The king had knighted him with his own sword, called him brother in arms, even entrusted him with the defense of the realm's most vulnerable border. To those who served beside him, the idea that he would ever turn cloak was unthinkable until it wasn't. Perhaps that's the cruelest lesson of his story, how easily the brightest loyalty can tarnish when ambition whispers in the dark. So what could drive such a man to treason? Was it greed, resentment, or something far more human? The fear that all he'd built might one day slip away. The knight's betrayal didn't happen in a single, reckless moment. It was a slow unraveling, stitched together in secret meetings and whispered promises. Under the guise of hunting trips and pilgrimages, he began slipping across the border into the lands of Duke Lothar, the king's most formidable rival. Their meetings were cloaked in deception, messages hidden in prayer books, signals passed through the flicker of torchlight in distant chapels. One chronicler later wrote of a coded letter, its ink laced with lemon juice to vanish until heated, revealing a chilling promise: the crown for your loyalty and the north for your keeping. The Duke wasn't just offering gold or titles, he was offering the knight a chance to rewrite his legacy from servant to sovereign. But why would a man who had everything risk it all? The answer lies in the simmering tensions of the age. The kingdom stood at a crossroads, its borders strained by years of failed harvests and simmering disputes over vital trade routes. The Duke's lands controlled the Silver Pass, the only reliable path for merchants moving goods between east and west. Whoever held that pass held the realm's economy by the throat. The knight knew this, and so did his new allies. By aligning with the Duke, he wasn't just betraying his king, he was handing a rival power the keys to the kingdom's wealth. A monk's account from the time spat venom at the act, calling it a dagger in the back of Christendom, not just for its treachery, but for the chaos it would unleash across a fragile continent. Yet the knight's motives remain shrouded in debate. Some argue it was greed, the Duke's coffers were legendary, and the knight's own lands lay in a drought-stricken region. Others whisper of vengeance, pointing to the king's refusal to grant his daughter's hand in marriage, a slight that festered in the knight's pride. But the most haunting theory, that he saw the tide turning and chose survival over loyalty. The Duke's forces were growing, his alliances multiplying. Perhaps the knight, ever the strategist, simply bet on the winning side. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the map itself. The lands promised to the knight weren't just rich, they were strategic, a buffer zone between two rival powers. By controlling them, the Duke wouldn't just gain a traitor's service, he'd gain a foothold to launch invasions deeper into the heartland. Every coded message, every midnight meeting, was a stitch in a noose tightening around the kingdom's neck. And then, inevitably, came the slip, a servant's loose tongue, a broken wax seal, a letter intercepted. The knight's carefully woven web began to fray, and with it, the last chance to turn back. The king's spies were closing in, and the realm stood on the brink of a revelation that would shatter its peace for generations. The king's reaction to the betrayal was not the fiery outburst his court expected, but something far more chilling, a silence so profound it made the throne room feel like a tomb. Chroniclers wrote of how his fingers tightened around the arms of his chair until the wood groaned, his face a mask of stone. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a death sentence. Let his name be unspoken, his deeds unwritten, his blood unfit for the earth. This wasn't just anger, it was the cold, calculated dismantling of a man's entire existence. Within hours, heralds rode to every corner of the realm, their proclamations stripping the knight of every title, every acre of land, even the right to bear a family name. The rituals of disgrace were as precise as they were brutal. In the castle courtyard, the king's own hammer shattered the knight's sword, not with a warrior's fury, but with the solemn strikes of a mason sealing a tomb. The fragments were melted down and recast into coins stamped with the king's face, a cruel joke that turned the knight's honor into petty currency. Meanwhile, servants scrubbed his heraldry from every banner, every stained glass window, even the marginalia of royal manuscripts. One witness described how painters worked through the night, their brushes blotting out the knight's likeness from a decade's worth of tapestries, leaving ghostly outlines where a hero once stood. But this was more than a personal vendetta. It was a political earthquake. The Duke, sensing opportunity, immediately declared the king's actions tyrannical, rallying other disgruntled nobles under the banner of defending ancient rights. Overnight, the realm split like rotten timber. Towns that had prospered under the knight's protection now flew rebel colors, while border lords who'd secretly envied his favor saw their chance to seize his abandoned lands. The king's justice, meant to restore order, had instead poured oil on a smoldering feud. What transformed this clash of egos into a war that would consume generations? The answer lies in the fragile web of feudal oaths. By branding the knight an outlaw, the king didn't just punish one man, he challenged the very system that bound nobles to their word. If loyalty could be erased with a hammer and a decree, what stopped other vassals from questioning their own vows? The duke seized on this fear, his messengers weaving tales of a monarch who'd trade centuries of custom for the sweetness of revenge. Soon, skirmishes erupted along the Silver Pass, then full battles, then sieges. The king's pursuit of justice had become a rallying cry, but not for peace. For war, and as the first castles burned, no one yet understood how deep the shadow of that single betrayal would stretch. The first battle erupted not in some distant wasteland, but in the very fields where the knight had once trained his men, a cruel irony that didn't escape the veterans who now faced each other across the trampled wheat. Dawn had barely broken when the king's forces, clad in his crimson livery, formed a shield wall along the ridge overlooking the River Thorn. Opposite them, the rebel army flew the knight's old banner, now defaced with Duke Lothar's black boar, a visceral reminder of how swiftly allegiances had shifted. One chronicler, a monk who'd once dined at the knight's table, wrote of the eerie silence before the charge. No war cries, no horns, only the creak of leather and the whisper of prayers, as if both sides feared waking the ghosts of their shared past. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against peace. The river's shallow bends forced the rebels into a narrow approach, their flanks exposed to archers hidden in the reeds. But the knight, now leading Lothar's vanguard, had learned the land's secrets from years of patrols. He split his forces, sending a contingent of light cavalry splashing upstream to outflank the king's left wing. Eyewitnesses described the moment the trap sprang, how the rebel horsemen emerged from the mist, their swords glinting like teeth, crashing into the unprepared infantry. They fought not as strangers, but as men who'd shared bread, wrote one survivor, his account stained with grief. I saw my own cousin's face beneath a rebel helm before his mace found my shoulder. What made this clash so emblematic wasn't just its brutality, but its intimate savagery. The king's staunchest defender, Sir Gareth, a grizzled campaigner who'd stood beside the knight at Blackridge, found himself dueling his former protege in the mud-choked shallows. Chronicles differ on who struck first, but all agree the fight ended with Gareth's sword buried in the knight's thigh, and the knight's dagger pressed to Gareth's throat. Yet in that suspended breath before the killing thrust, something fractured. The knight hesitated, his eyes flickering to Gareth's surcoat, still bearing the king's crest they'd once sworn to defend together. That split-second lapse cost him. Gareth twisted free and the tide turned. By dusk, the field was a quilt of carnage. The rebels retreated, but not before torching every village along the Thorn's banks, their smoke pillars a grim signal to the kingdom. Burial details worked through the night, piling the dead so thick that, according to one account, the earth refused to swallow them whole. Among the slain lay a squire barely 15, still clutching a ribbon his sister had tied to his arm for luck, a detail that would later fuel ballads of lost innocence. But the most haunting sight, the king himself kneeling in the mud to close the eyes of a fallen captain, his fingers lingering on the man's eyelids as if sealing a promise. This wasn't just a battle lost or won, it was the unraveling of an era, and as the survivors limped home, they carried with them a dawning horror. The war had barely begun. The betrayal didn't just fracture a kingdom, it shattered the very glue holding medieval society together. Across the realm, lords who had exchanged wedding vows and wine cups for generations now found themselves staring across battlements at kin. Take the powerful House of Volton, their eldest daughter married to the king's cousin, their youngest son squiring for Duke Lothar. When war came, the family tore itself apart like parchment in a storm. The father, too frail to ride, watched helplessly as his children chose sides, one son leading cavalry charges against the castle where his sister sheltered behind its walls. A troubadour's lament from the time still echoes. What use is blood when honor drowns, brother's sword on brother's crown? Marriage pacts, once the bedrock of stability, became ticking weapons. In the Western Marches, Lady Elspeth's union with Lord Beric had united two feuding regions for 20 peaceful years. But when Beric declared for the rebels, Elspeth's own father ordered her seized as a hostage, the wedding contract now just ink on spoiled parchment. Even the clergy couldn't stem the tide. A bishop's chronicle describes a chilling scene at the Abbey of St. Aldrich, where two knights' cousins who'd taken communion together that morning met in the cloisters at dusk, daggers drawn over a disputed border their grandfathers had peacefully shared. The chaos revealed a brutal truth about feudal oaths. They were only as strong as the men who kept them. Vassals who'd sworn to hold no lands but by my liege's grace now scrambled to justify switching allegiances. Some claimed the king's punishment of the knight violated ancient customs. Others whispered that survival demanded pragmatism. A surviving letter from Lord Garin to his steward lays bare the calculus. If we stand with the crown, Lothar burns our crops. If we bend the knee, the king brands us traitors. Choose the slower poison. Genealogies from the period tell their own grim story. Where family trees once branched with alliances, now they're scarred by ink blots, entire lines scratched out, names defaced with symbols of exile. The archives at White Tower preserve a particularly haunting document, a betrothal agreement between two noble houses, its margins filled with later scribbles accusing the groom's family of harboring the traitor's shadow. The marriage never occurred, yet amid the wreckage, glimmers of unexpected defiance emerged. In the mountain town of Briar's Hollow, the common folk refused their lord's order to torch a neighboring village tied to the rebels. A tanner's guild ledger records their reasoning. They are our buyers of hides, their children our playmates. Let kings fight their wars, we keep our peace. For a fleeting moment, the betrayal's ripple met a wall of ordinary courage, but such resistance was rare. Most discovered, as the chronicler Sister Merwin wrote, that when great men break faith, small men pay the price in broken bones and burned fields. Could such spiraling chaos ever be contained? The answer lay not in the grand strategies of lords, but in the quiet desperation of those who still remembered what peace tasted like. A grain merchant's diary from the war's third year holds a telling entry. Today, my wife wept over an apple. It came from an orchard now in rebel hands. She asked if we'd ever taste fruit from home again. In that simple longing for sweetness, for normalcy, lay the fragile hope that might one day stitch the realm back together. But first, the storm had to spend its fury. The war's unrelenting grind created a desperate demand for blades, any blades regardless of whose hands held them. As noble levies dwindled from disease and desertion, both crown and rebellion turned to mercenaries, those rootless men who fought not for oaths but for purses heavy with silver. They came in waves, hardened veterans of foreign wars, bandits turned soldiers, even disgraced knights who'd traded their heraldry for the anonymity of a hired helmet. Chroniclers dubbed them the Wolves, not just for their ferocity, but for how they prowled the edges of the conflict, always circling toward the scent of profit. What made these men so terrifying wasn't their skill, though many were lethally efficient, but their utter indifference to the rules of war. a bishop's letter to the Pope seethed about a company that stormed a monastery, not for strategy, but because rumor claimed its reliquaries held gems. They spilt the blood of brothers over the very stones meant to honor martyrs, he wrote, laughing as they tore vestments for bandages. Unlike the knight's betrayal, which at least bore the twisted logic of ambition, the mercenaries' violence was transactional, a butcher's arithmetic where every village burned was just another line in a ledger. Yet their presence revealed a bitter irony. The knight had broken feudal bonds for power, but these men exposed how hollow those bonds had become. When Duke Lothar's paid chests ran low, an entire company defected mid-battle, abandoning their posts to plunder the Duke's own supply train. The king fared no better. His treasurer's records show payments to one captain who'd previously sacked 3 royal towns, his loyalty flipping like a coin. "Gold has no memory," quipped a mercenary in a tavern song that soon spread through both camps, its chorus a mocking jab at the nobles who'd once claimed divine right to rule. The worst atrocities became grim lessons in unchecked savagery. At the siege of Belbridge, a band of crossbowmen, frustrated by delayed wages, herded townsfolk onto the bridge they were meant to capture and set it ablaze, a grisly spectacle meant to demoralize the defenders. A surviving guard's account describes children's shoes floating downstream, the leather barely scorched, as if the river itself refused to swallow the evidence. Even veterans who'd fought beside the knight at Blackridge recoiled. One wrote to his son that war had once been a bitter duty, but now resembled the revels of hell. This lawlessness didn't just claim lives, it corroded the medieval world's foundations. Monasteries, once sanctuaries, fortified their gates. Peasants, realizing no lord could protect them, began hiding harvests or fleeing to bandit gangs. A guildmaster's diary from the period captures the shift. "We taught our apprentices to honor rank and custom. Now they ask why, when the great lords hire cutthroats and call it policy." The mercenaries, with their cold pragmatism, held up a mirror to the hypocrisy of an order built on chivalry but sustained by brutality. And so the war spiraled, its original cause the knight's betrayal, now buried beneath layers of vendettas and opportunism. The wolves, having tasted blood, would not be easily kennelled. As the conflict stretched into its second decade, even the Duke and King began to fear the monsters they'd unleashed. A secret missive between them, later found mouldering in an archive, admitted a shared dread. That victory might mean ruling over a realm where the only law left was the edge of a paid man's sword. The walls of the Betrayer's keep loomed like a clenched fist against the storm-washed sky, its granite blocks scarred by 100 failed assaults. For 3 grinding months, the king's forces had encircled it, their trebuchets hurling stones that shattered like bread crusts against the tower's mythic thickness. Then, on the morning the chronicles would later call the day the rains turned to fire, a lucky shot from a mangonel cracked the northwest gatehouse. The breach was no wider than a wagon, but it was enough, as royal archers loosed volleys of flaming arrows to mask the advance. The king's vanguard surged forward, not with the orderly ranks of pitched battle, but in a desperate, single-file scramble over rubble slick with blood and rainwater. Inside, the knight had prepared his endgame. Every corridor became a killing zone. Murder holes rained jagged scrap metal. Stairwells were rigged to collapse under weight, and the great hall's tapestries, once depicting his victories, now concealed pits of smoldering pitch. A squire's diary, recovered from the ruins, describes the surreal scene. Noblemen in tattered silk doublets manning crossbows beside kitchen boys, their faces streaked with soot and defiance. Yet the most chilling detail, the knight himself, clad not in armor but in the embroidered surcoat he'd worn at his knighting, as if daring the king to remember what he'd once been. When the final confrontation came, it wasn't in the soaring throne room or atop the battlements, but in the keep's chapel, a cramped, candlelit space where the knight knelt before the altar, his sword laid across the reliquary like an offering. Accounts diverge wildly here. The royal chronicle claims he sneered as the king entered, hurling a goblet of wine at the crucifix before drawing a dagger. But a wounded man at arms, interviewed years later by a traveling scribe, swore the knight's hands shook as he whispered, "For the love we bore one another, grant my men mercy." The truth may lie in the artifacts. The knight's blade, when examined, showed no blood on its edge, and the reliquary bore a fresh scratch where a signet ring, perhaps pressed in a final plea, had scraped the silver. What happened next became legend. Some say the king, in a burst of fury, struck the killing blow himself. Others insist he turned away, letting his executioner's axe fall while he stared at the chapel's rose window, its stained glass scattering light across the knight's crumpled body. But the most haunting version comes from a washerwoman who claimed to eavesdrop from the choir loft. She described how the knight, in his last breath, grasped the king's wrist and murmured not a curse or a confession, but a scrap of an old hunting song they'd sung together in better days. Whether poetry or fact, the detail resonates because even in death, the knight understood his true punishment wasn't the axe, but the unbearable weight of what they'd lost. With the keep's fall, the war should have ended. Instead, it mutated. The Duke, now styling himself Lothar the Avenger, commissioned tapestries portraying the knight as a martyred saint, his blood watering the seeds of rebellion. Meanwhile, the king's grief curdled into something darker. His decrees grew harsher, his justice more exacting. A formerly neutral baron's letter to his brother captures the shift. "We fought to punish a traitor, but now our king drinks from the same poisoned cup." The siege hadn't broken the cycle of vengeance, it had cemented it, and as fresh armies mustered under banners stitched with the knight's defaced heraldry, the realm braced for a war not of borders or succession, but of unending reckoning. The war wasn't just fought with swords and siege engines. It was waged in the pages of manuscripts, the verses of ballads, and the sermons echoing from pulpits. Both sides understood that controlling the story meant shaping the future. The king's scribes worked tirelessly, their quills transforming the knight's betrayal into a cautionary tale of ambition's corruption. One illuminated chronicle, commissioned for royal libraries, depicted him with horns and cloven feet, his shadow stretching across a map of the burning realm. Meanwhile, Duke Lothar's poets spun him as a tragic hero, a man too loyal to a false king, his fall from grace framed as martyrdom. These weren't just stories, they were weapons sharpened to turn hearts and justify carnage. The church, caught between its spiritual role and political alliances, became an unwitting battlefield. Bishops loyal to the crown preached that the war was God's wrath for broken oaths, their sermons illustrated with lurid tapestries of helmets swallowing traitors. In rebel-held territories, radical friars turned communion bread into propaganda, declaring it unfit to share with a king who murders his own. A surviving parish ledger from the period shows scribbled notes beside tithe records. Half the flock left when Father called the Duke God's scourge. Faith, once a unifying force, now deepened divisions. Public opinion hardened like drying ink. Taverns became echo chambers where ballads dictated allegiance. One popular tune, The Lion's Tears, portrayed the king weeping over the knight's corpse, a fiction so potent it sparked riots in towns that had never seen battle. Meanwhile, rebel broadsides circulated crude woodcuts of the king feasting while peasants starved, their captions accusing him of devouring the realm's soul. The truth grew irrelevant. What mattered was whose narrative stuck. A merchant's letter to his brother reveals the chilling effect. Our village swore for the crown, but after the minstrel's song last market day, 3 families packed their carts for rebel lands. Words are cheaper than swords and deadlier. The most insidious legacy, how these stories outlived the war. Chroniclers employed by the victors scrubbed rebel accounts from official records, but fragments survived in marginalia, a monk's defiant footnote, a stained glass window hidden behind plaster, a lullaby humming the knight's name. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover a child's slate in the ruins of Belbridge, its scratched letters still legible. Papa says the knight was brave. History had become a prize to be won, its retelling a continuation of the conflict by other means. In our age of viral narratives and algorithmic echo chambers, the medieval propaganda war feels uncomfortably familiar. The tools have changed, but the stakes remain the same. Whoever controls the story controls the future. The knight's betrayal wasn't just a spark for war, it was a blueprint for how easily truth becomes collateral in the battles we wage with words. The fields that once fed kingdoms lay fallow, their furrows choked with weeds and the bones of livestock picked clean by crows. Tax rolls from the war's later years tell a grim arithmetic. In the county of Blackmere alone, harvest yielded less than a third of their pre-war bounty, while royal levies doubled then tripled to fund mercenary bands. A merchant's ledger from the period, its pages stained with what might be wine or blood, lists prices that would make a modern economist blanch. 1 bushel of wheat, 12 silver pennies, 1 arrowhead halfpenny, 1 day's safety on the roads priceless. The Silver Pass, once an artery of commerce humming with spice caravans and wool trains, became a gauntlet of burned waystations and skeletal wagons, their owners long since fled or buried in shallow ditches. Peasants pushed beyond endurance turned their scythes into weapons. In the summer of the war's 7th year, a wave of revolt swept the southern valleys, their battle cry, bread or blood. Scrawled on barn doors and church walls in charcoal and rust, a bailiff's report to the crown survives, its hurried script betraying panic. They swarm like locusts, these hunger-maddened men. They care not for king or duke, only for the children wailing in their hovels. The irony was cruelest in the knight's former lands. Once the realm's breadbasket, his estates now resembled a wasteland. The irrigation channels he'd built with his first fortunes clogged with debris, the granaries that once overflowed reduced to ash. A traveling friar's journal mocks the absurdity. The traitor's wheat fed armies, but never his own starving tenants. Such is the wage of treason, a legacy of hollow silos and graves. Rebuilding began not with grand proclamations, but with small, desperate acts of resilience. In the charred remains of market towns, survivors bartered not with coins, now worthless without the king's stamp, but with skills, a blacksmith's nails for a weaver's cloth, a midwife's knowledge for a fisherman's catch. Tax collectors, themselves gaunt from missed meals, turned a blind eye to fugitives tilling hidden plots in forest clearings. The most telling record comes from an anonymous scribe who etched a plea into the margin of a ruined psalmbook. Let the lords keep their war. We plant beans where their horses trampled the barley and pray the saints forget their names. Yet even in this desolation, glimmers of a brutal truth emerged. The knight's betrayal had exposed the fragility of a system that relied on honor to sustain its coffers. When oaths crumbled, so did the economy they'd underpinned, a lesson not lost on the next generation. A young steward's treatise penned years later, its ink fading but its wisdom sharp, distilled it plainly. No kingdom can tax loyalty, nor mint trust into coin. After the last sword is sheathed, the real battle begins not for land, but for the faith to rebuild it. The nursery walls of Prince Edric's chambers were papered with maps, not the brightly inked charts of trade routes or pilgrimage paths, but battle plans, their edges frayed from his small fingers tracing the advance and retreat of armies. By the time he could recite his letters, he knew another language, the names of every fortress lost after his father's humiliation at the siege of Betrayal's keep. His bedtime stories weren't fables of dragons or saints, but the royal chronicler's account of the knight's treachery, read aloud each night like a lullaby laced with venom. Remember, his nurse would whisper as she extinguished the candles, "A king's first duty is to scour away shame." By his 12th birthday, Edric had carved those words into his writing desk with a dinner knife, the grooves darkening with ink from his furious quill. Meanwhile, across the sea in a crumbling coastal tower, the knight's son Tomas learned history from a different angle. The exiles who raised him spoke of his father not as a traitor, but as a man betrayed, by a king who'd broken feudal law, by allies who'd melted away like spring snow. His earliest memory, an old sergeant lifting him onto a table to study a tattered banner, its embroidered boar half-eaten by moths. "This was your birthright," the man growled, pointing to the stains along its edge. "Not blood from battle that's honorable. This is from the king's men dragging it through the mud." Tomas grew tall on a diet of vengeance, his tutors drilling him not just in swordplay, but in the genealogies of every noble who'd turned against his house. By 15, he could recite their weaknesses like a merchant tallying debts. Two boys, two versions of the past, both steeped in the certainty that justice demanded violence. When they finally met on the field at Harrow's Fen, Edric leading the royal vanguard in his father's refurbished armor, Tomas commanding rebel skirmishers under a banner stitched from his mother's wedding cloak, their clash felt inevitable. Chroniclers would later marvel at how their duel mirrored their father's last encounter. The same locked gazes, the same moment of hesitation when recognition flickered behind the hatred. But this time there was no chapel, no relic to soften the blow. Tomas's spear found the gap in Edric's cuirass just as the prince's mace shattered his collarbone. The real tragedy, they might have been friends in another life. A squire's letter home captures the surreal pathos. The prince wept as they carried him off, not from pain, but because Tomas had gasped, "Your father stole my apples before falling." Some childhood slight festered for a decade. What made this generational war so relentless wasn't just the weight of the past, but the way each fresh loss compounded it. Every burned village became a nursery for new grievances. Every fallen comrade's name was etched into family Bibles alongside vows of retribution. Even peace overtures curdled in the making. When Edric's younger sister was betrothed to Tomas's cousin to seal a truce, assassins poisoned the wedding cups before the vows were spoken. A minstrel's satirical song put it bluntly, "Feed a grudge with your last crust, and your children will feast on ashes." Yet for all the darkness, glimmers of rebellion against the cycle flickered in unexpected places. In the war's 23rd year, a company of young knights too young to remember the original betrayal refused orders to torch a rebel-held abbey, their captain declaring, "We'll not become the villains of our own story." And in the archives of a border monastery, a scribe penned a heretical question in the margin of a psalter. "If the knight's sin was pride, what is ours when we make his ghost our standard?" The answers wouldn't come in time for Edric or Tomas, both destined to die in skirmishes over land neither truly wanted. But their children's children would inherit a realm so exhausted by blood that even the bards ran out of vengeful rhymes. Sometimes it seems the only way to break a curse is to outlive it. The first foreign troops arrived not with war horns blaring, but under banners of white silk embroidered with doves, a gift from the King of Almaria, who swore his forces came only to guard the innocent. Their polished armor gleamed as they distributed bread in starving villages, their commanders pressing silver into the hands of local priests. But the letters intercepted by the king's spies told a different story. One Ulmarian general's note to his mistress, hidden in a wine cask, boasted, "Every loaf we hand out buys us a mile of coastline when the dust settles." Neighboring realms had watched the conflict like vultures circling a dying stag, and now they moved to carve their share. The Duke of Varenne's intervention was even bolder. His fleet sailed into the strategic port of Saltmark under pretense of mediating peace, only to seize the harbor's cannon towers under cover of fog. A merchant's frantic dispatch to the royal court survives, its ink blurred by seawater. They fly our colors by day, but at night their engineers reinforce the gates against us. What made these incursions so insidious wasn't their brute force, but their veneer of legality. Varenne's lawyers produced a 200-year-old marriage treaty to justify the occupation, while Ulmarian scholars lectured about the sacred duty of strong nations to shepherd the weak. Ambassadors became puppeteers, pulling strings with honeyed words. In the archives of Castle Wyvern, researchers found a smoking gun, a coded letter from the emissary of Lorath to his sovereign, its cipher cracked centuries later. The key passage reads, "Let the wolf and the boar exhaust each other, we shall plant orchards in the ashes." Lorath's troops would linger just beyond the border, waiting to pounce once both sides collapsed. Even neutral Switzerland, famed for its mercenaries, couldn't resist the fray. Their bankers financed all sides, their ledgers revealing loans to both king and duke at ruinous interest, with castles and mines as collateral. The war's turning point came when these interventions transformed it from a civil conflict into a continental power game. At the Congress of Brynwold, foreign envoys openly debated partitioning the realm like a butchered deer. A surviving sketch from the meeting shows the Ulmarian delegate's dagger pinning a map over the fertile Blackwater Valley, while the Varenne representative's wineglass left a stain engulfing the western mines. The king, once focused solely on crushing rebellion, now faced an existential threat, fighting not just for his throne but for his kingdom's very borders. Yet the gravest consequence of foreign meddling wasn't lost territory, but the rage it ignited among commoners. Peasants who'd endured years of hardship now watched outsiders strip their land under false pretenses. In the fishing town of Greycliff, a mob dragged 3 Ulmarian quartermasters into the square, their pockets stuffed with grain requisition orders. A friar's journal records the scene. They spat not on the king's name nor the duke's, but on the foreign tongues that called their hunger collateral. When royal troops arrived to restore order, they found the town's gates barred, not rebellion, but in defiance against all masters, native or foreign. The war had birthed a new monster, the fury of those with nothing left to lose. The first scythes rose not in open battle, but in the pre-dawn gloom of 1,000 village greens, their blades whetted on despair. As the war's endless taxes bled the peasantry dry, taking first their grain, then their livestock, finally the very straw from their pallets, the serfs realized their fists could clench as well as beg. What began as scattered riots over bread prices soon hardened into something far more dangerous. Organized bands of farmers marching under makeshift banners stitched from sackcloth, their weapons repurposed plowshares and hunting bows. A bailiff's frantic report to his lord survives, its ink blotted with sweat. They move like wolves now, not sheep, blockading roads, burning tax rolls, and worse, they speak of rights. The nobles' panic was palpable. In the archives of Castle Thornford, researchers found a series of increasingly unhinged decrees from the Count of Marlock. His earlier edicts ordered the swift hanging of ringleaders. Within months, he was demanding entire villages be scoured with fire until not a child remembers rebellion. But the most revealing document, a secret letter between lords, its margins crammed with shaky script. "If we lose the peasants, who will bury our dead or bake our bread?" Even the hangman eats. Their terror wasn't just about violence, it was the dawning realization that feudalism's illusion of divine order had cracked. The rebels' demands, scrawled on petitions nailed to church doors, exposed the system's hypocrisy. They asked not for crowns or castles, but the abolishment of the Heriot tax that let Lord seize a family's best cow when a father died, and an end to forced labor during planting season. One particularly eloquent manifesto, likely penned by a runaway monk, cut to the heart of it. If a man's sweat builds a lord's hall, why does his child shiver in a hovel? The war had given them a brutal education. Watching nobles switch allegiances for profit taught them that oaths were just words, and power was there for the taking. A tattered diary hidden beneath the floorboards of a ruined cottage holds the era's most haunting voice. Its author, a farmer named Hugh, wrote by rushlight after days spent hiding from press gangs. Yesterday, the king's men took my brother to fight the duke. Today, the duke's men took my son to fight the king. Why must we die for their quarrels while they feast in stone halls? His final entry, dated the eve of his village revolt, is smudged with what might be tears. If hanging's the price of saying no, let the rope remember my name. The noble's retaliation was predictably savage. At the so-called harvest of blood, royal troops surrounded a rebel camp at dawn, slaughtering not just the armed men but their families, the bodies left unburied as a warning. A knight's boastful letter to his bride survives. We stack them like cord wood. Justice smells of turnips and rust, but the true measure of their failure. How many rebels escaped to the forests? How many ballads sprang up painting hanged men as martyrs? A ditty sung in taverns for decades after taunted. You can kill the plowman, but who'll turn the earth when your fields lie fallow? These uprisings were crushed, yes, but they left scars no victory could erase. The war had taught the powerless a dangerous lesson, that castles could burn and lords could bleed. And though the next revolutions were still generations away, the seeds had been sown in blood and ashes. As one astute chronicler scribbled in the margin of his ledger, when you break a man's back to build your throne, don't be surprised when he stands up to topple it. The church stood at the crossroads of conscience and power, its golden crosses catching the light of burning villages. For every bishop who preached that war defiles the soul, another declared rebellion a holy duty against tyranny. Papal bulls fluttered like conflicting commandments. One year, the Pope excommunicated Duke Lothar's supporters as oath-breakers who feast with the devil. The next, his successor damned the king's mercenaries for ravaging Christ's flock. A surviving copy of the Bull de Bello Justo in the Vatican archives bears furious marginalia from an anonymous monk. If war is just only when Rome says so, why does the sword cut the same on both sides? Amid this moral quagmire, one figure emerged as both beacon and cautionary tale: Brother Aldrich of the White Hand, a scribe turned peacemaker. Armed only with a reliquary containing a splinter of the true cross, he walked unguarded into war camps, negotiating temporary truces so farmers could harvest crops before winter. His diary, hidden for centuries beneath a monastery's flagstones, reveals the cost. Today, I convinced Lord Garin to spare the miller's boy. Tomorrow, I must convince the miller not to poison Garin's well. For 3 fragile years, Aldrich's efforts saved countless lives until the day both sides denounced him. The king's confessor called him a dove sent by the serpent, while rebel priests accused him of keeping children alive to starve later. When soldiers finally dragged him from his chapel, the chronicles claim the reliquary in his hands wept blood. The war didn't just test the church's authority, it fractured faith itself. In the mountains of the east, a heresy called the Ashen Creed took root, its followers claiming God had turned his face from the realm. Their radical text, the Book of the Silent Heaven, argued, If angels watch massacres and do not stir, then either heaven is empty or it approves. More damningly, peasant prophets arose, declaring that the true Christ wore a beggar's rags, not a bishop's mitre. A terrified archbishop's letter to Rome wailed of villages where priests were barred from altars unless they swore oaths to feed the hungry before counting tithes. Even miracles became weapons. When a spring in rebel territory reportedly healed a blind girl, the Duke's propagandists proclaimed it divine favor. The king's scholars countered that the water was tainted by sulfur, the very stink of hell's endorsement. A weary nun's account from a border convent captures the despair. We used to debate how many angels dance on a pinhead. Now we ask how many orphans fit in a mass grave. The final irony, the war outlasted the men who'd started it. By the time the last papal legate collapsed from exhaustion, his carriage mired in mud between battle lines, the conflict had birthed something darker than anyone foresaw. Not heresy, not even godlessness, but a chilling indifference. A charcoal sketch on a tavern wall from the era says it all. A peasant shrugging at a crucifix, his speech bubble reading, "He hasn't answered in 30 years." Why bother asking? The church had warned that war would damn souls. It hadn't imagined it might render them silent. The war that history remembers as a clash of kings and knights was also waged in the quiet corners of solar chambers and the flickering light of convent scriptoriums. While chronicles obsessed over battlefield maneuvers, the realm's women, officially powerless, relentlessly ingenious, shaped the conflict in ways parchment seldom recorded. Take Queen Elena, the steel-spined regent who ruled for her infant son after the king's hunting accident left his skull shattered near the rebel frontier. Court poets dismissed her as the mourning dove, but the treasury accounts tell a different story. Her neat marginalia in the ledgers pay the Swiss captains double, but ensure their contracts forbid looting, reveal a strategist who understood mercenaries better than her husband ever had. Within a year, she'd leveraged her late daughter's betrothal treaty to bring the navy of her brother, the Count of Lies, crashing onto the Duke's coastal strongholds. A spy's intercepted letter sneered that her skirts hide more daggers than an armory, but the truth was subtler. Elena fought with ink and alliances, her victories measured in grain shipments secured and defectors bribed. Then there was Lady Marguerite of Thornbrook, whose lavender-scented letters to her dear cousin in the rebel camp concealed battle plans in the stitches of her embroidery patterns. A surviving sampler, now displayed in the royal archives, shows innocent floral borders until held to light, where pinpricks in the linen map the Duke's supply routes. Her greatest coup, convincing the Duke's own chaplain to carry these gifts to his wife, exploiting the church's immunity to search. When the king's forces ambushed a grain convoy using her intelligence, Marguerite celebrated not with feasting, but by donating the reward to a nunnery. "Let them think me pious," she wrote to her sister, the phrase underlined twice. But for every woman who bent the war to her will, there were those bent or broken by it. The knight's wife, Aliena, exists in records only as the traitor's widow, her lands confiscated, her name scratched from genealogies, yet a fragmentary letter, hidden in the lining of a chest rescued from their burned estate, hints at a darker tale. Addressed to her brother, it pleads, "If you ever loved me, take the children before he returns. I cannot dissuade him from this path." Was she a helpless spectator, or had she, like so many noble women, known of her husband's treason but lacked the legal standing to protest? The sole surviving portrait of her, painted years before the betrayal, shows a woman with ink-stained fingers, perhaps a scholar, perhaps merely fashionable. We'll never know. The Duke's later claim that she shared her husband's guilt smells of convenience. Her execution conveniently transferred her dower lands to his favorite general. The cruelest irony lies in how these women's stories were preserved not in chronicles but between the lines. A laundry list from Eleanor's household includes 3 bolts of black silk for the messenger's widow, hinting at her network of couriers' wives. A rebel song mocking Marguerite as the lace-clad viper unwittingly confirms her effectiveness, and Aliena, she lingers only in the court clerk's dry notation. Item: 1 woman's dowry chest emptied of valuables. For every woman who carved agency from the war's chaos, a dozen more were reduced to footnotes, their voices muffled by the clatter of men's armor. History, as the saying goes, is written by the victors. But perhaps it's more accurate to say it's written by those holding the pens, and how rarely they were women's hands. The war's legacy isn't just in who won or lost, but in whose names we remember, and whose whispers we strain to hear beneath the roar of battles. He began as just another blade for hire, a nameless sellsword with scars where his lineage should have been. By the war's 30th year, they called him the Mercenary King, though whether it was a title or a curse depended on who you asked. Roland of the Black Banner didn't conquer his throne in some glorious charge. He stitched it together from the war's frayed edges, one betrayal at a time. His rise reads like a manual on opportunism. First, he turned on the Duke who'd hired him, handing over a rebel fortress to the crown in exchange for lands. Then, when the king's coffers ran dry, he liberated those same lands back, this time as their protector. A tavern song from the period jeered, "Roland's loyalty fits in a coin purse if you sew the bottom shut." But the true masterstroke came when he wed the widowed Lady Isolde, whose family traced their bloodline to the realm's founders. Overnight, the mercenary became a lord, his rough hands suddenly fit to grasp a scepter. Their marriage contract, preserved in the archives, includes a chilling clause. The lady's title shall pass to her husband, but her dower lands remain under his control only so long as she lives. 3 months later, Isolde died hunting her horse allegedly spooked by a hornet. The chronicler who dared to write "convenient" beside her obituary was found with his tongue nailed to the gates of Roland's new castle. Yet for all his brutality, the Mercenary King ruled with a reformer's zeal. His legal code, the Black Edicts, standardized weights and measures across his stolen territories, punishing fraudulent merchants with public mutilation. He established the first secular courts, bypassing corrupt bishops, though his judges were, without exception, former captains from his mercenary days. Even his enemies admitted his roads were safer, his towns cleaner. A traveling scholar's diary muses, he taxes the poor to build bridges, then hangs nobles who skip the tolls. Is this justice or just another shakedown? Roland's reign was a living contradiction. He minted coins stamped with his scowling profile, a peasant's face on royal gold, while his spies vanished children who sang rhymes about the crown bought by corpses. His infamous boast at the Feast of Skulls chilled even his allies. "Treason made me, loyalty unmakes fools." The message was clear: in this war, only the flexible survived. And so the conflict lurched toward its final, feverish stage. With the old king dead and the duke crippled by gout, the realm was a carcass picked clean by vultures. Roland's ascent proved the unthinkable. That birthright meant nothing anymore. The remaining nobles scrambled to forge new alliances, but the rules had changed. When the Mercenary King's armies marched on the capital, they flew no banners, just black flags stitched with a single word in blood-red thread: mine. The field at Harrow's Fen lay strangely still beneath a sky the color of unpolished iron, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and old blood. Here, a century after the knight's betrayal had first torn the realm apart, the last sons of that ancient grudge assembled for a battle no one truly wanted. The king's grandson, Edric the Younger, sat astride a horse whose ribs showed through its coat, his armor pieced together from 3 generations of scavenged plate. Across the mire, Tomos's bastard son, known only as the Red Hawk, adjusted a vambrace strapped with fraying leather, their banners one bearing the faded lion of the crown, the other a boar sewn from stolen cloaks, hung limp in the lifeless breeze. A chronicler hiding in the reeds later wrote that the armies didn't cheer or taunt, but stood as men at a funeral where no one mourns. Then came the rain, slow at first, then torrential, turning the fen into a sucking morass. Arrows loosed from trembling bows arced lazily before thudding into the mud, their fletching ruined. Horses stumbled, men cursed as their boots sank to the knee. A soldier from the king's rear guard, a boy barely 17, fumbled a sodden scrap of parchment from his tunic, his last letter, its ink bleeding into the fibers. "Tell mother I fought well," it read, the words smudged by rain or tears. He never sent it. By midday, the charge had devolved into a grotesque parody of war, knights wrestling in the sludge like drunkards, their swords too heavy to lift. A rebel smith, his hammer meant for shaping armor, split a royal squire's skull with a single blow, then vomited into the trampled rushes. When the horns finally sounded retreat, no one could say who'd ordered it or why. The dead lay where they fell, their faces erased by mud, their weapons rusting in the downpour. The living staggered back to camp, not as victors or vanquished, but as shades of themselves. A supply wagon's ledger from that night records the absurdity. Issued 23 clean bandages, 60 rations, 1 priest for last rites, received nothing. The war didn't end that day in some glorious parley or dramatic surrender. It simply stopped, like a mill wheel grinding to a halt when the last grain is spent. In the years that followed, chroniclers would argue over who'd won. The crown kept its throne, but its coffers were empty, its authority a brittle shell. The rebels melted back into the forests, their grievances unresolved but their strength exhausted. The mercenary king, watching from his stolen castle, reportedly laughed when a messenger brought word of the stalemate. 100 years of butchery, he sneered, and all they've proved is that corpses make poor foundations. The truth was uglier and simpler. After generations of blood, the realm had nothing left to give. The last entry in a farmer's almanac from that season captures the eerie quiet that followed. Planted the south field today, no riders came to burn it. No one came at all. The war hadn't ended with a bang or even a whimper, just the hollow sound of a spade biting into earth and the hope, fragile as a seedling, that this time the harvest might be for keeping. The Treaty of Greyford was signed in a hall draped with silk banners, the air thick with incense to mask the stench of unwashed nobles and old blood. On parchment, it looked like peace, borders restored to their pre-war lines, hostages exchanged to ensure goodwill, and a promise of shared tolls from the Silver Pass. The king's scribes called it a triumph of reconciliation, but the ink barely concealed the rot beneath. One clause demanded the knight's descendants publicly renounce his name, yet allowed them to keep the lands they'd seized during the war. Another required the duke's men to kneel before the crown, but only after dark, to spare their pride. A diplomat's smuggled diary, its pages stained with wine, confessed the truth. We papered over hell with parchment and called it law. Outside the hall, the realm told a different story. In the villages along the Thorn River, farmers pulled charred timbers from their fields, their children scrounging for arrowheads to trade for bread. The treaties promised reparations never arrived, just a cartload of salt dumped at the crossroads, too spoiled even for preserving meat. A washerwoman's letter to her sister, hidden in a hollow tree for centuries, captured the absurdity. Yesterday, the herald said the war was over. Today, the tax collector came for his share of our peace. The hostages, meant to be living guarantees of truce, became walking insults. The king sent his least favorite nephew, a bookish boy with a clubfoot, while the rebels offered up a half-blind archer who'd once shot the royal standard-bearer. They dined together in gilded cages, their meals seasoned with mutual loathing. A guard's ledger from their prison tower records the petty rebellions. Day 47. Prince tore another page from the Psalter to fold into dart. Archer called him cripple again. Both went hungry by choice. Even the apologies were weapons in disguise. The Duke's formal regret for the knight's betrayal was delivered by a herald who tripped accidentally on the king's cloak. The king's reciprocal sorrow for excesses in war came with a list of the rebel dead, each name mispronounced with relish. A minstrel's ballad from the period sneered. They broke bread with one hand, sharpened knives with the other. And so the peace curdled into something worse than war, a cold, simmering resentment that poisoned every harvest, every marriage, every whispered prayer. The mercenary king, watching from his stolen towers, had the last laugh. Treaties are for men who still believe in tomorrow. In the end, the only legacy of Greyford was the unspoken truth etched into every survivor's face. Some wounds don't close, they just learn to bleed quietly. War doesn't just bury bodies, it buries truth, twisting memory into whatever shape serves the living. In the decades after the Treaty of Greyford, the knight's betrayal became less a historical event and more a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or grievance needed justification. Ballads penned in taverns turned him into a pantomime villain, his sins growing taller with each retelling. One particularly lurid song, The Traitor's Feast, described him feasting on the king's stolen wine while orphans wailed outside the castle gates, a scene no chronicle ever recorded. Yet in rebel-held valleys, another version took root. The Knight's Lament, a mournful dirge that painted him as a man too honorable for a dishonorable age, his downfall orchestrated by jealous lords. The same figure, two legends, one a cautionary tale, the other a rallying cry. A traveling minstrel's journal, stained with ale and cynicism, captured the absurdity. They pay extra for the version that fits their grudges. Truth tastes dull compared to seasoned lies. The war's vandalism wasn't confined to songs. In the scriptorium of the Abbey of St. Aldrich, where monks had once illuminated Bibles with gold leaf, soldiers carved their initials into the walls. The priceless Chronicle of Kings, a manuscript painstakingly copied over generations, was found stuffed into a fireplace, its vellum pages curled like dead leaves. A novice's frantic note, hidden in a candle niche, pleads. They took the ink to seal wounds, the parchment to bandage them. What use is scripture when men pray with swords? Yet amid the ruin, glimmers of defiance flickered. At the ruined convent of Our Lady of Thorns, an anonymous nun sewed a subversive embroidery, a scene of the Nativity, but with the Holy Family sheltered beneath a knight's discarded cloak. The stitchwork, deliberately uneven, made the fabric shimmer like tears when the light struck it. Few artifacts capture the war's cultural wounds like the so-called tapestry of broken oaths, now displayed behind glass in the Royal Museum. Woven by the guild masters of Lorville shortly before their city burned, its threads tell a story of unraveling trust. The central panel shows the knight kneeling not to the king or the duke, but to a faceless figure holding scales weighted with gold. Over time, the wool depicting his armor has frayed to bare threads, leaving him skeletal, while the gold threads remain unnervingly bright. Conservators say the damage came from generations of viewers picking at the metallic strands, as if trying to steal back what was lost. But the most insidious scars were the ones left on language itself. The word loyalty, once a sacred bond, became a punchline in merchant circles, where contracts now required notarized oaths and armed witnesses. Children's nursery rhymes sprouted dark verses. Hush now, princeling, close your eyes, the knight who swore was first to lie. Even the act of remembering grew politicized. When a bard at the mercenary king's court dared to sing the lion's tears, the ballad portraying the king's grief over the knight's death, he was flogged for stirring old ghosts. The king's own historian later scribbled in the margins of his official account, "History is the tale told by the last man standing, the rest are just footnotes." What does it mean for people to inherit not just ruins, but a broken vocabulary for making sense of them? The war didn't just kill soldiers, it murdered the very narratives that once held the realm together. A philosopher writing decades after the conflict posed the unanswerable question: when every truth has two shadows, how do we know which way the light once fell? Perhaps that's the cruelest legacy of all, not the blood spilled, but the stories we tell to justify it, until even the bones forget their original shape. History is never set in stone, it's wet clay reshaped by every generation to fit new hands. Take the knight's betrayal. In the kingdom's official records, he's a monster, his name scrubbed from rolls and his face scraped from murals. But cross into the old rebel territories, and you'll find village squares where children still leave flowers at weathered statues of the loyalist, their school books calling him the last man who dared to defy tyranny. A single event split into two irreconcilable truths. The textbooks tell the starkest tale of this divide. In the royal capital's academies, students memorized dates under a woodcut titled The Traitor's Noose, the knight's body dangling while angels clutch scrolls listing his sins. Yet in the mountain towns once loyal to the duke, that same day is marked as the martyr's dawn, with illustrations of the knight breaking chains instead of oaths. A scholar comparing both versions noticed eerie similarities, the same clouds, the same castle silhouette, but with the central figure flipped from villain to hero. History isn't written by the victors, he quipped. It's rewritten by everyone who survives. Even the earth beneath battlefields became contested ground. When archaeologists uncovered mass graves at Harrow's Fen, royal-funded teams insisted the bodies were peasants slaughtered by rebel raiders. Rebel scholars countered that the wounds, blunt trauma to the back of skulls, matched royal execution methods. The debate grew so heated that a neutral monastery finally sealed the bones in an unmarked crypt, its abbot sighing, "Let God sort them, we've forgotten how." Modern historians peer through this fog of myth with weary skepticism. Dr. Ilara Voss, in her landmark study The War That Never Ended, put it bluntly, "Every age remakes its past to haunt its present." Call a man traitor long enough, and you justify your own purges. Call him patriot, and every rebellion after him wears his face. The knight's ghost, it seems, is still conscripted into battles he'd barely recognize. And perhaps that's the betrayal's final, ironic twist. The knight sought to change his fate, but instead became a mirror, one that reflects whatever fear or hope each era holds. Today, protesters in the capital burn effigies of him during riots, while separatists in the highlands sew his defaced heraldry onto their banners. His story, stripped of flesh and blood, is now just a weapon, and the war, it seems, never really ended. Just the battlefields changed. Centuries may separate us from the knight's fateful choice, but the sting of betrayal still cuts just as deep in today's halls of power. Consider the modern diplomat who smiles across a negotiating table while secretly forwarding classified cables to a rival nation, or the CEO who preaches corporate loyalty as they quietly offshore jobs to inflate their bonus. The tools have changed, but the playbook remains eerily familiar. Ambition dressed as necessity, trust weaponized against those who grant it. A leaked email from a high-profile political scandal reads almost like a medieval chronicle. They'll call us traitors now, but history remembers the winners. The words could have been torn from the knight's own coded letters. Corporate boardrooms and parliamentary backrooms now face the same corrosive doubt that once poisoned feudal oaths. When a whistleblower exposes corruption in a pharmaceutical giant, or a cabinet member resigns over secret dealings, the fallout isn't just legal, it's cultural. Employees who once wore company logos with pride start eyeing each other over cubicle walls. Voters who believed in campaign promises now dissect every speech for hidden agendas. A study on organizational trust after major scandals found that teams take an average of 17 months to regain even half their previous cohesion, if they ever do. That's longer than it took the king's armies to march on the betrayer's keep. Yet the most haunting parallel lies in who bears the cost. The knight's treason ignited a century of war, but it was peasants who starved in scorched fields, children who grew up knowing only the shadow of swords. Today, when politicians renege on healthcare pledges or bankers gamble with pension funds, the consequences ripple far beyond the guilty. Factory towns hollowed out by broken promises, families bankrupted by predatory loans. These are the modern equivalents of the tanner's ledger pleading for mercy. A union leader's protest sign at a recent labor rally put it bluntly: "Our bones are still the mortar for their castles, so who are today's knights?" Perhaps they're the tech executives who wield data like a feudal lord's levy, or the influencers trading followers for political favor. Their armor is tailored suits and viral tweets, their battles fought in courtrooms and algorithm feeds. But the real question isn't who wears the title, it's how we break the cycle. Medieval peasants eventually stopped accepting oaths as divine writ. They revolted when the weight of betrayal grew heavier than their fear. In our age of transparency apps and grassroots movements, we're still wrestling with the same lesson. Trust shouldn't be a one-way sword. History's cruelest joke is how faithfully it repeats itself, not in events but in human nature. The knight's story endures because it's never really about the past. It's a warning etched in parchment and pixels alike. When the next betrayal comes, and it will, remember this: the true measure of a society isn't whether treachery occurs, but whether the powerless must always pay its price. The knight's grave lies in a forgotten thicket, its moss-choked headstone tilted like a drunkard's grin. Official records claim he was buried in unconsecrated ground, yet someone, perhaps a defiant squire or a grieving lover, carved his name into the stone under cover of darkness. Today, the site is neither shrine nor ruin, but something stranger, a contested patch of earth where history and myth tangle like brambles. Every spring, wildflowers appear in a cracked ale jug at the base of the stone, their petals the same crimson as the surcoat he wore at Blackridge. No one claims responsibility. The groundskeeper of the nearby abbey mutters about fools who romanticize traitors. Yet even he admits the flowers are always fresh, as if the earth itself refuses to let his memory wither. Debates over the knight's legacy rage in unlikely corners. In the university town of Loxford, a radical theatre troupe staged the Oathkeeper's Gambit, a play depicting him as a reformer crushed by a corrupt crown. The climax, where the knight tears his own cloak to bandage a peasant's wounds, drew cheers from students and hisses from the mayor, who called it treason prettied up with poetry. Meanwhile, in the Duke's ancestral hall, a tapestry commissioned by his great-granddaughter weaves a subtler narrative. The knight stands not with sword raised, but with hand outstretched to a fallen comrade, his face obscured by shadow. Is it rehabilitation or propaganda? The curator's notes call it a reminder that even broken oaths cast long shadows. The knight's living descendants walk a tightrope of silence and pride. In a rare interview, Elara of House Volton, a botanist who shares his amber eyes, confessed her family's duality. "We were taught to spit at his name in public, but my grandmother kept his signet ring hidden in her sewing box. She'd rub it for luck during storms." When pressed on whether the knight deserved redemption, Elara paused, then offered a gardener's wisdom. "Even the most poisoned soil can grow new things." But you don't get to decide what takes root. Historians remain divided. Dr. Thomas Renaud's Betrayal's Anatomy argues the knight was a product of feudalism's rot, not its cause, while Dame Isabel's best-selling Traitor's Blood insists some stains never fade. Yet in a quiet archive, a crumbling letter from the king's own chaplain complicates both views. "Yesterday, I found His Majesty standing where the knight last knelt. He touched the altar's edge where the dagger fell and whispered, 'What if I'd listened?'" Perhaps the knight's true legacy isn't in statues or arguments, but in the uncomfortable question he forces every generation to confront. When does justice become vengeance, and when does clinging to old wounds become its own betrayal? The flowers on his grave never answer. They simply bloom, fade, and return persistent as memory, fragile as forgiveness. Loyalty isn't just a medieval virtue, it's the invisible thread stitching societies together across centuries. The knight's betrayal peeled back the layers of feudal oaths, revealing a truth as raw today as it was then. Trust is the currency of power, and once debased, the entire system crumbles. Picture those trembling hands clasped in vassalage ceremonies, swearing faith unto death under the gaze of saints and swords. Now fast forward to a modern boardroom, where a CEO's signature on a contract carries the same weight as a knight's handshake over a relic. The parchment has changed, but the peril remains. Break that bond, and you don't just betray a person, you fracture the foundation of every relationship built on that promise. Yet here's the paradox: the warning signs of betrayal haven't evolved much since the age of chainmail. Isolation, that silent predator of loyalty, creeps in long before the act. The knight didn't wake one morning and suddenly turn traitor. He drifted first, withdrawing from feasts, skipping chapel, holding whispered councils in torch-lit corridors. Today's equivalents: the executive who stops eating lunch with the team, the politician who ducks constituents, the friend whose texts grow cryptic. Then comes the hunger for gold, for status, for control. A tax collector's ledger from the war's early days records the knight suddenly buying up borderlands at thrice their worth. Sound familiar? Think of the banker gambling with client funds, or the influencer trading authenticity for sponsorships. Grief follows greed like a shadow, but here's the twist: betrayal isn't always a dagger in the dark. Sometimes it's the slow poison of neglect. A general's memoir from the war's later years laments how the king's courtiers, by mere indifference, starved their own people. They didn't actively conspire, they just stopped caring. Modern workplaces call this quiet quitting, but the effect is the same. Trust erodes not in landslides, but grain by grain. So how do we armor ourselves? The answer lies in the words of a grizzled mercenary captain whose journal survived the war's ashes. Loyalty is the armor of nations, but it must be fitted anew each dawn. He didn't mean blind allegiance, he meant vigilance. The medieval world had its heralds to proclaim oaths. We have transparency, accountability, the courage to demand reciprocity. When a knight's word was his bond, society functioned because the cost of breaking it was exile or death. Today, our contracts have clauses and penalties, but the real deterrent is the same as it ever was: the weight of a name dragged through history's mud. The knight's story isn't a relic, it's a mirror. Every time we choose shortcuts over integrity, whispers over honesty, we inch toward his path. But here's the hope: unlike him, we have centuries of hindsight lighting the way. So when the next temptation comes, whether it's fudging numbers or ghosting a friend, remember the fields of Harrow's Fen, where a single betrayal grew into a century of graves. Loyalty isn't just about keeping promises, it's about proving again and again that some words are still written in stone. The war's true legacy isn't etched in chronicles or carved into monuments. It lingers in the silent, battered objects that survived the carnage. Take the helm of Sir Gareth, the grizzled knight who dueled his former protege in the shallows of the Thorn. Its once gleaming surface is now a mosaic of dents, the deepest a brutal groove along the temple where the traitor's dagger nearly found its mark. For years, it gathered dust in a noble family's attic until an archivist noticed the faintest inscription inside the rim, for Aldrich who laughs at death. A joke between brothers in arms, scratched with a knife point during some long-forgotten campaign. Now it sits in a glass case, reflecting not just light, but the unbearable weight of what was lost when loyalty turned to steel against steel. Then there's the wooden horse, no larger than a man's palm, its paint worn to ghosts of color by small fingers. Found beneath the floorboards of a cottage near the betrayer's keep, its tail is snapped off, its legs scarred with teeth marks. Carbon dating places it precisely in the war's third decade, a time when such toys were rare as laughter. Historians argue whether it belonged to a child who fled the siege or one who perished in it. But the curator who handles it wears gloves not to protect the artifact from oils, but to hide the way her hands shake. Children's toys outlive kingdoms, she once told a visitor. That's the real tragedy. Even parchment tells secrets if you know how to listen. In the vaults of the Royal Archives, a team painstakingly reassembles a scroll torn to shreds during the sacking of Belbridge. Using ultraviolet light, they've teased out phrases between the bloodstains. Beg for mercy, the well is poisoned, tell my wife, the rest forever lost. The archivist leading the project, a man with ink-stained cuffs and exhaustion in his voice, admits they'll never reconstruct the full message. But the fragments matter, he insists. They prove someone tried to speak across the chaos. That's more than most got. Walk the battlements of Castle Wyvern today, and your fingers will still catch on arrow strikes fossilized in the stone, each notch a frozen scream. Guides love to point out the lucky shot that felled a rebel captain, but the real story is in the mortar. Analysis reveals it's mixed with crushed bone, likely scavenged from pyres when the siege dragged into winter. The castle's current lord, a pragmatic man who hosts weddings in the courtyard, refuses to let historians test further. Some shadows don't need stirring, he mutters, polishing a signet ring that may or may not have belonged to the knight himself. These objects are more than relics, they're the war's last witnesses. The helm remembers the weight of a vow broken. The toy horse carries the imprint of hands that never grew old. The scroll fragments whisper of voices the war tried to erase, and the castle walls, they stand as a warning that violence once unleashed seeps into the very stone. The lesson isn't just in the grand betrayals or the clashing armies. It's in the quiet, stubborn persistence of things that refuse to let us forget. If the knight's ghost walked the ruined halls of Betrayer's Keep tonight, would he recognize the world his treachery shaped? The first lie whispered over a candlelit map, unspooled into a century of charred fields, shattered oaths, and children who learned war before they knew peace. From that solitary act of betrayal bloomed a harvest of consequences. The siege of Blackridge, where former brothers clashed in the mud. The mercenary king's rise, proving honor could be bartered like salt. The peasant revolts that exposed feudalism's fragile spine. Every battle, every broken treaty, every silent meal between hostages carried the same bitter aftertaste, the metallic tang of a dagger drawn in shadow generations earlier. Yet the war's true cost wasn't measured in battles lost or lands conquered, but in the quiet erosion of trust that outlasted even the graves. A vassal's handshake once bound lives. After the night, it demanded witnesses and signed parchments. Brides once wed for alliance now eyed their grooms like spies. The very language of loyalty grew hollow, a coin rubbed smooth by too many palms. A chronicler scribbled aside in a monastery ledger captures the shift. Asked why he deserted, the soldier shrugged. If oaths are just wind, why not chase better pay? So was it worth it? The lands he coveted became wastelands. The duke who promised him glory died choking on his own blood. His name, instead of ringing through history as a hero's, became shorthand for treachery, yet also a rallying cry for every rebel who ever felt wronged. The knight's legacy isn't a single act, but the fissure it opened in the bedrock of society, proving how easily order crumbles when men trade bonds for ambition. Here's the lesson that echoes across the centuries. Betrayal isn't a solitary crime, but a debt that compounds with interest. The dead pay in unmarked graves and silenced voices, but the living inherit the reckoning. Every time we choose shortcuts over integrity, whispers over truth, we edge toward his path. History's betrayals warn us not as dusty tales, as mirrors. Choose loyalty wisely, not because it's easy, but because its shadow stretches farther than any blade's reach. As the last survivor of Harrow's Fen carved into his cottage beam before the fever took him, the dead pay, but the living remember. And remembrance, it turns out, is the heaviest price of